Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are so excited to welcome Doug Dawson with Leg Up Solutions with us today. He is one of our Shingo licensed affiliates and certified to teach the Shingo workshops. As a reminder, we are going to have a Q&A session at the very end of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A feature and not the chat feature on Zoom. And we'll turn the time over to you, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I love the Shingo Institute. I've actually been involved with the Shingo Institute since my days as an undergrad at Utah State University. I was at one of the very first partners in business seminars where the Shingo prize was awarded. So that was an exciting time for me, and I've been able to maintain that relationship over the years, and I'm very proud to be able to be very focused on the Shingo Institute, the Shingo model right now. So hang on just a minute here. Apparently I have a technical difficulty. That always happens with the technology, doesn't it? I don't know why it is not responding, but let's just go manual. So anyway, we're here to talk, or I'm here to talk to you today about why organizational excellence needs to have a standard. And I'm really excited about this, that this is something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, and that we've had discussions about within our business, just trying to understand where the gaps are and how we can fill those gaps and how we can help organizations to better understand and achieve organizational excellence. But I've got a shout out that I'd like to do first. The shout out is for O.C. Tanner. And I don't know if you read Fortune magazine, but in this month's issue of Fortune magazine, in an article called The Battle for Talent, O.C. Tanner says that 79% of employees who quit their jobs say a lack of appreciation was a major reason for leaving. That really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the topic today, but I actually read that about an hour and a half ago and decided to plug it in because I think it's great that O.C. Tanner is being recognized by the press for their organizational excellence. So I think that's outstanding, and it might be something worth you taking a look at. Again, that's Fortune magazine. You can see down here at the bottom in the June and July issues. So let's move ahead. Let's just kind of take a brief look at what we're going to be talking about. Some of you remember standardized testing, and if you're as old as I am, you remember standardized testing where you got the little saddle stitch booklets, and you were told to bring a number 2 pencil with you to do your testing, and then you'd use the graphite to fill in the little circle for 1 through 5 or A through E or whatever the case may be. And that was a standard. And so we're going to use that standardized how they started that standardized testing for the very first part of our agenda, which is to begin now. And we'll get back to begin now in a minute, but after begin now, we'll talk about some regulatory standards and why those are important. Then we'll talk about certification standards and why we accept those, why we deem those as important. Then we'll talk about standard work, which we should all have some familiarity with. We'll finally talk about organizational excellence standards. And then after that, we'll talk about the Shingo standard. And then as with standardized testing, when we used to have the number 2 pencils, we'll wrap things up by putting our pencils down. So let's get started. Begin now. A standard starting point. One of the things that the Shingo Institute reached out to me about when I gave them the topic was, is there a question I wanted to ask that they could pull on? And so I said yes. And the question was, do you feel the standard for organizational excellence is clear? Now, that seems like, for those of us familiar with the Shingo model, that should be the case. But maybe not. I was actually pretty encouraged and excited about the results. So here are the results on the left. If you take a look at the left, you'll note that this is actually the count, and on the right, it's the proportion of that count. So for very much so, as you see in the legend in the bottom, 526 out of 830 some odd, or 1,830 some odd respondents said that they felt like the standard for organizational excellence was clear. That's a little shy of 30%. What that tells us is that the rest of them pretty much felt like not. No. So they had 14.5% that were undecided, 12% that were completely arbitrary, some to 31% to some degree, and not so much at 13%. That's 1,300 people out of the 1,800 some odd that were polled that felt like the standard for organizational excellence was at the very best ambiguous. What that means is we've got some work to do. And I'm really excited about the opportunity that that presents. I thought about maybe putting the no in red, but we decided to stick with the branded colors for our business. But what do we always say about the red when we take a look at visual management? We say that there's gold in the red. So I see this as a huge opportunity. So let's talk about regulatory standards and why they're important. We accept regulatory standards, and probably the one that's closest to mind right now is the FDA. Now, not everybody on this webinar is from the United States, but most everybody should be familiar with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, simply because the U.S. markets pharmaceutical products all over the world, and so therefore other organizations, other countries are interested in what the FDA standards are and how the drug products have been approved for those standards. So anyway, you think about it in terms of the pandemic, and over the course of 2020, there was a race to produce a vaccine for COVID-19. But you think about it in these terms. Let's say a company steps forward, and what that company does is they say, we've done our own clinical trials, but we're not going to publish them. We feel very confident that the efficacy of this vaccine is as it should be. We're going to assert that it's 99% effective. In terms of purity and safety and potency, all those critical factors that the FDA monitors, we're going to sidestep just to move things along more quickly. But just trust us, because safety, purity, and potency are right where they need to be. Now, here's the question. How many of you listening right now would be interested in being vaccinated with that vaccine? It's not a very encouraging proposition. We accept standards and we embrace standards for different reasons. In this particular instance, it's because it has the best interests of the public health in mind. Now, again, it may not necessarily be with the FDA. If you're in a different country right now, you probably have an organization similar to the FDA that regulates food and drug in your country. In the United States as well, we also have the Securities and Exchange Commission. And what this is responsible for, this organization is responsible for the public safety, fiduciary safety, with regard to publicly traded. So if a company sells stock, that stock generally in one way or another gets sold to the public. And there are standards associated with the Securities and Exchange Commission and financial reporting that are necessary. And some of those standards have been fairly recent. Not so long ago, we saw the implosion of two different organizations, Enron and WorldCom, and that's because there weren't clear standards, or the standards were vague and could be manipulated. And so there's new legislation and new standards in place that prevent that manipulation in the public interest. I'll move quickly, but also in the Drug Enforcement Administration. What is the value of that? Well, if you're marketing, manufacturing and marketing, say opioids, there are standards there that have to be met. And they're not just standards with regard to safety and purity, but they're also standards with regard to control, because there's a process where they can be easily diverted, or the prevention should be to prevent them from being easily diverted, but that standard exists. And again, for each one of these, if you're not in the United States, if you're in a different country, then likely you have your own agencies that perform the same services. We have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for worker safety. And we have the National Transportation and Safety Board, which oversees airline production, airline travel, automobile production, automobile travel. There are standards there as well. The point is these are regulatory standards. Every country has them, regulatory standards, and the purpose of those standards is for the public benefit. We accept them, we appreciate them, we depend on them for our safety. So we're used to these standards, and they are not by any means arbitrary. So let's talk about certification standards. And I'll just talk about a couple here because there's a ton of them I could go through, but one that should be top of mind for just about everybody here is ISO. There are, and ISO stands for the International Standards Organization. And ISO is really important because what it does is it establishes standards for businesses with regard to supply chain, procurement, quality, production. And organizations come in and they get evaluated against those standards to determine if they can be certified as having met or exceeded those standards. The reason that's important is that in a business-to-business environment, many organizations are very interested in making sure that there's a high degree of reliability with regard to what an organization that they're engaged with is able to produce, was able to provide, is able to supply. That reliability is critical. And so those ISO standards exist for that very purpose. In the United States, we have the American National Standards Institute, which I'm not showing here, but that kind of ties into ISO a little bit. There's some collaboration there. But the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, actually determines what type of plastic and how thick that plastic should be and what the tensile strength of that plastic should be. It's actually Lexan for safety glasses or for safety shoes, as an example. But we understand ISO, we understand the importance of these standards, and in business, we embrace them. Another one with regard to food manufacturing, because I'm familiar with this because of 15 years in big food, but is a company called AIB International. AIB International acts on behalf of food regulatory agencies, such as the FDA in the United States, that don't have the resources to be able to directly regulate the food manufacturing industry. So what AIB International does is that they certify plants based on criteria that are based on AIB or FDA standards. The plants or the organizations that request the audits from AIB actually pay for that whole process, but then AIB comes in as an independent third party. They evaluate the plant, they give them a rating, and anything below 700, the FDA is alerted to, and then the FDA comes in. The scale goes from 0 to 1,000, and they publish this. They make it available. They're certified as being above the minimum standard, which is 700, to suppliers and customers because they're interested in that. For example, in the business that I worked in when I was in big food, we had several big companies like Taco Bell and other companies that were interested in our AIB rating. So we had to certify. Certification standards are important, and we accept those. In business, we embrace them because it enables us to be able to do business with a broader scope of individuals and companies. So certification standards are important as well. Let's talk about work standards. Everybody here should be familiar with work standards. And again, work standards are not arbitrary. You just can't say, I'm going to do the work. You have to have a standard, because if you don't have a standard, then you can't improve. You can't measure it, and you can't improve what you can't measure. So we understand work standards, or standard work, and that's commonly what it's called. In shingle workshops, it's not uncommon when we start talking about standard work for some people to get confused. They don't really understand. So it goes by many different names. Another name is work instructions. And sometimes those work instructions are visual. Sometimes they're lines of text. They're, depending on your business, it just depends on what's best for your business. What's most important is that they are not arbitrary. They are a standard to which somebody has agreed. In the pharmaceutical industry, I had 15 years in big pharma. In the pharmaceutical industry, we call them SOPs, at least in the company that I work for, standard operating procedures. But some companies actually just call them procedures. But again, they're established. They're the standard by which results are measured for the work that's being done. They are not arbitrary. One final thing about standard work, there's another type of standard work that people don't really think much about. But in process flow, fluid process type manufacturing, such as some food production, chemical production, some pharmaceutical production, and even in your own, there is a standard. And that standard is referred to as recipes. So these recipes are in industry, they're piloted and trialed until they work the kinks out, and then it becomes a standard. If you're doing a recipe in your kitchen, which could arguably be a chemical process, then that recipe that you're using to make whatever it is that you're making, that cake or that casserole or whatever, that standard has typically been tested a number of times before it's been released. But it's not arbitrary. Now, if you're a chef and you really understand flavors and how they work together and whatnot, then you could probably wing it. But most of us require a standard, and we accept that, we embrace it. Standards are not arbitrary. So the question becomes one around organizational excellence. Let's go back to our question. Before we do, though, I just want to ask one simple question. And maybe you know the answer to this for your own organization. I can't speak for your organization, but are standards a mud on the wall approach? Are standards a mud on the wall approach? Let's go back and take a look at the data. So the question is, do you feel the standards for organizational excellence is clear? The answer, nearly or a little over 70% of the people say that were polled say no. That would suggest that some organizations struggle with understanding what standards are for organizational excellence. They may have arbitrary standards. In other words, they may be throwing mud on the wall. But there are standards for organizational excellence. Let's start with one that was created in 1988. This is it again in the United States. In your own country, you may have something similar to this, but it's called the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, and it was created in 1988. The very first recipients, the two first recipients of the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award were Cadillac and Ford Motor Company. That standard still exists. It's no longer really, it's called a quality award, but it's no longer considered a quality award. It's considered an award of organizational excellence. For those of you that have been in Shingo workshops, you can see video oftentimes from one of the directors emeritus from the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award talking about the importance of the Shingo model and other things. But the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award has become more aligned with organizational excellence than just strictly quality. The same year in 1988, the Shingo Prize was created. And that also is a standard for organizational excellence. The difference is that it's an international standard. It's internationally recognized. Some years later, another standard was created that's internationally recognized. This standard was created by the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, and it's called the AIM Excellence Award, which again focuses on organizational excellence, and it's internationally recognized. These are great standards. I'm biased. I'm a Shingo affiliate. My business is a Shingo affiliate. And I've been involved with the Shingo Institute since 1989. So clearly I have bias, but that doesn't mean that other standards aren't good as long as they're recognized and established. So let's talk about Shingo standards simply because of my bias and because that's what I'm here to do. You should be familiar with the Shingo model. We have systems. Those systems drive behaviors. The the tools of those systems deliver results, and there are guiding principles that inform the behaviors of the culture, which again influences the way the systems and tools deliver those results. We understand this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time preaching to you about the Shingo model. You should be familiar with it. What's really important is the Shingo model creates the standard for the Shingo Prize. And there are some things worthy of note with regard to the Shingo Prize. It's the first internationally recognized standard for organizational excellence. The first. And that's clearly established because there are 32 years of history as the standard. And that history is important because over that period of time, there are, I think now, nearly 400 recipients of Shingo Awards. So when I say Shingo Awards, I mean the bronze medallion, the silver medallion, and the Shingo Prize itself. Associated with all that is the data that's collected by the Shingo Institute as those organizations challenge for that prize. Even more important is the fact that there are tons and tons of organizations that challenge for the prize that don't get it, for which the Shingo Institute still has data. There is a clearly established history of the Shingo Prize being a standard, and that history is a solid 32 years. And then finally in 2000, the Shingo Prize was referred to as the Nobel Prize of Manufacturing. You people know this. The Nobel Prize of Manufacturing by Business Week magazine, which is now Bloomberg. It's a Bloomberg publication. It's not called, I think it's called Bloomberg News now. But that's significant. Nobody else had ever said anything like that about any other prize, even the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, which was created at the same time. Business Week said that of the Shingo Prize. And it was then called the Shingo Prize of Manufacturing Excellence. But the fact of the matter is over time, we came to understand that manufacturing is a process. And so you can apply it to any process, which means that you could apply it to services as well as goods, the manufacture of goods or the production of services. That's important because until recently, as a result of the pandemic, we had an annual financial services summit and an annual healthcare summit put on by the Shingo Institute. Hopefully those things will resume. But the point is as a standard, the Shingo Prize and the Shingo model apply universally to any process. It's the Nobel Prize, without a doubt. So where does that take us? Here we are at the end of our discussion. We're ready to put our pencils down. I want you to think about standards as we talked about them. They cannot be arbitrary. I can't assert that I have organizational excellence on my website if I have not been willing to compare myself to a standard. I can, but it's not, I can make that assertion, but it's hollow unless I've been willing to find a standard that's recognized and to benchmark against that standard and even challenge that standard to see if I can exceed or meet or exceed that standard operationally or as an organization. So the question I have for you in conclusion is, what is the standard that you're going to pick? I don't really care which one it is, but if your organization is truly going to excel, you need to pick a standard. And it can't be arbitrary. You can't throw mud on the wall. You can't say it is just because you want to say it is. Pick a standard. I don't care if it's something within your own country, like the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award in the US. I don't care if it's the AIM Excellence Award. My preference would be that it's the Shingo Prize, but it's better that you pick a recognized standard than just throw mud on the wall. So thank you very much, and we'll go to questions now.
Great, thank you so much, Doug. If you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and we will be looking at that shortly.
So somebody just popped in here and said, What happens to organizations that are not interested in winning a prize, but use the model to improve and become excellent? You know, if you don't want to compare yourself, if you don't want to challenge for the prize, that's okay. What's even more important is that you challenge yourselves. I'm also an examiner for the Shingo Institute. We're examining an organization right now on our team. There are several teams examining organizations right now. But one of the things that this organization said is that, you know, whether we get this award or not, whether this is the Shingo Prize is something that's awarded to us or not, we're looking beyond that. We're looking at what further we can do to challenge ourselves so that we can improve. And that's the value of the Shingo model or any other standard. So I think O.C. Tanner, and if I misquote, please correct me, but I believe O.C. Tanner said that they were going to challenge for the AIM Excellence Award one year because it was different. It provided a new and different challenge. So it doesn't matter so much that you challenge for a prize. What matters is that you challenge yourselves. All right. What happens to the organizations? Okay, we saw that. How does the TPM model stack up against the Shingo model? TPM is actually a process or a system for one aspect of the business. So total productive maintenance or total preventive maintenance, it's been coined both ways. So that's a standard for excellence for a system within a business. So you could call that operational excellence if you achieve that standard, but it doesn't do anything for the organization as a whole, except that it brings it a little closer to organizational excellence. So what's the standard for organizational excellence? The question I have there is, are you looking just at production? Because production is only one aspect of the organization. What about customer service? What about sourcing and procurement? What about transportation and logistics? All those are part of the organization. So I would challenge TPM as a standard for organizational excellence. Leadership standard work. What is the importance of this tool to an organization? How to add value with this tool? Leadership standard work, organizational excellence for sure. The key point about leadership standard work is it needs to be defined within the organization as to what that is and how it will deliver the results that are expected. On a very generic level, leadership standard work should be focused on driving a culture within the organization that delivers sustainable results. About 80% of your time should be spent in leadership, if you're in senior leadership, on that aspect alone. And 20% should be on operational, strategic, and tactical stuff. That may not be realistic in your organization, but it's an ideal that you can certainly aspire to. One thing that I just found very interesting that I also read in Fortune magazine is the CEO of Verizon, who I believe is Swedish. The CEO of Verizon actually times all of his activity so that he makes sure that he is giving as much time as he's committed to with regard to building a culture within the Verizon organization that delivers results. I think that's outstanding. That's a great idea of how to track your leadership standard work. Next question. What makes the Shingo standard better than the others? I like it. That's why. Now, that's very biased, and I understand that. As I said, I don't really care what standard an organization works towards, as long as they pick a standard that's not arbitrary, as long as they're not throwing mud on the wall, seeing what sticks and saying, well, that's our standard. It can't be an arbitrary standard. It needs to be established and recognized. And the three that I gave are established and recognized, two of which are globally recognized. So ASQ may have something. They have a lot of certifications, but I don't know if they have anything with regard to organizational excellence. But that would be interesting to take a look at. APICS, the American Production Inventory Control Society, I think they've changed their name recently, may have something as well. They have certifications for individuals, but what is the standard for excellence that they have established? So research it and find it. Find what works for you and for your organization. All right. What do we have next here? What are some of the standards that are looked at that would qualify a business for a shingle prize? Well, the shingle model. I think that's pretty simple. The shingle model is the standard. You have all the tools. A lot of the stuff like TPM that was mentioned earlier, those are tools, those are systems that you can apply. What you have to figure out is how to make those work. And that's what the shingle workshops do, is they focus on helping you to understand the behaviors that drive the results that you're looking for, or how to rid your organization of behaviors that are impeding your results, except for systems design. Systems design is a deep dive into how systems drive results and why it's important to make sure that your systems are relevant and vibrant and current. Is that it?
That is all that we have time for today. Thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate it.